Herzlich willkommen bei Kontrapunkt. Heute darf ich wieder einen großartigen Gast bei mir begrüßen, und zwar Charles Coulombe. Charles Coulombe ist Schriftsteller und Historiker und hat unter anderem ein Buch über den seligen Kaiser Karl geschrieben, den letzten Kaiser Österreichs. Und er wurde außerdem von Johannes Paul II. Höchst selbst zum Kommandeur des päpstlichen Sylvesterordens ernannt. Und weil es aber sprachlich für ihn ein bisschen einfacher ist, werden wir das Interview jetzt gemeinsam auf Englisch führen. Dear Charles, welcome. How are you today?
Great, great. Another day in Austria. How could it be otherwise?
Amazing. So, if I'm not mistaken, you were made Knight Commander of the Order of St. Sylvester by Pope John Paul II himself. What's the story behind that?
Oh, man. Well, frankly, not much in the sense that I suppose it was because of my history of the popes. It was kind of a strange thing, really. I didn't expect it, and it was sent me directly. Usually, these things are done through the local bishop, but I can assure you, my Cardinal Mahoney would not have given me the order of the dog catcher, let alone the order of Saint Sylvester. I mean that in a nice way. So, I suppose you liked the book.
Mm-hmm. Which book exactly? Could you talk about that? I think it's Vicars of Christ, the history of the popes, right?
It is. It is indeed, and it went into both Czech and Magyar. It was the first book I think I ever had that went to foreign languages. And basically, it's the story of the popes from Peter initially to John Paul II, and then after his death, a second edition was brought out, which covered Benedict and the early days of Francis. So, but basically, I go pope by pope by pope. You see how every pontificate has had its problems, its strengths and its weaknesses, and how, well, there are saintly popes, but there are none that are perfect. There have been a few that have been downright evil, and there have been a lot that have been mediocre, kind of like people in general. Popes are very much like people, actually.
Very good. Well, yeah. I guess he must have liked it then.
I believe that I've always felt that an honest exploration of history will always, in the end, make the faith look good. It may not make the faithful look good. It may make them look like morons and dimwits, if, in fact, that's what they are. And they often are. But the faith itself is true. And, of course, the tremendous problem that every pope, every prelate, every priest, and every layman has is attempting to serve in his own muddled, difficult way something that's so far beyond it.
Yeah. I suppose it's the old argument that, the people who run the church, if they're so mediocre and the church still exists, it's a proof of its divinity, right?
Yeah, I think that's a fair argument. I mean, Boccaccio said it in the during the Renaissance, and Cardinal, I forget which one, but one of them said it to Napoleon, and it's very true. Which shows you that we're very much like the children of Israel in the Old Testament, whose covenant we inherited, if you will. In the Old Testament, you see the children of Israel doing everything they can to betray the covenant and to sell it unless they can give it away for free. Well, that's the story of the people of the New Covenant as well. Not one to make us proud of ourselves, frankly.
So what exactly is the Order of St. Sylvester? So you're a knight. Does that mean you ride a horse and go to battles in armor, or what exactly do you do there?
No. And in fact, papal knighthoods, by those I mean, well, there were five notionally. The Order of Christ is the highest. Nobody has that order anymore. They're all dead. Then comes the Order of Christ, the Pian Order. That's the Order of Pius that goes to heads of state and heads of state and ambassadors and people like that. I'm missing one. I can't think of it. And then there are the orders of St. Gregory and Sylvester. And the Order of St. Gregory generally goes to people who donated a lot of money to the church or who were military men. And the Order of St. Sylvester generally goes to artists and writers and people like that. But it's a medal. There are no meetings or anything of that nature. It's not like the Order of Malta or the Order of the Holy Sepulchre or even the Order of the Garter or the Golden Fleece, all of which have annual meetings and church services and so forth. The papal orders, the closest they come to any kind of an organization is that some countries have an organization of papal knights, but that's all generated by the knights themselves. It's not from Rome.
Okay. Okay, interesting. And so it's more of an honorary title, you could say, right? It's an honor, yeah.
Yeah. There's the uniform that goes with it that, in the case of Sylvester, is black, and it's its own shade. They call it Sylvester Black. The Order of St. Gregory has a green uniform. And so it goes. The Order of Moses is red, the Order of the Holy Sepulchre is white, etc. But these uniforms are less and less seen because so many prelates regard them as just being too military, too filled with toxic masculinity. It's the same impulse that leads them to forbid the Knights of Columbus in the United States from drawing their swords in churches, at the elevation, because that's just too male. They get very upset by that.
I see. Well, to switch topic, you are known as a monarchist and as a defender of monarchism, maybe one of the most, famous ones. And what exactly is monarchism? How would you describe it or define it? And why would somebody be a monarchist? Like, what do you think are the advantages of that, for the common man who's maybe not the monarch himself or the aristocrats who rule the country?
Well, it all depends on what you want to be ruled by. Do you want to would you rather be ruled by someone who's trained from birth, A, in the position, and B, in the notion that if he rules you badly, he'll fry forever in hell? Or would you rather be ruled by someone for whom you're a cow, to be milked to squeak? It's really that simple.
I think I'll take the first one in that case.
Oh, really? I don't understand. I much prefer the second because it's what we have. And remember, if you want anything better than what we've got, you're a larper.
Right.
What you need to do is embrace what you have. The leadership we've got is the brightest and the best. And they showed us during COVID. As I like to say, when they had us put on our masks, they took theirs off. No, but seriously, as to what monarchism is, well, monarchy has almost as many meanings as republic does, or democracy. People talk about democracy all the time, and they don't define it. You have in Europe today, all over the continent, from Britain to Germany and Austria, you've got people saying about how sometimes people, usually in government now, how you have to sometimes violate democratic values in order to preserve democracy. I see. I get it. That's like you said during Vietnam. Sometimes you have to destroy a village in order to save it. I get it. I understand. What they mean by democracy is that they're in charge and you're not. I mean that in a nice way, everything. But the truth is that democracy, as we've been taught, doesn't really exist outside of very few places. Some of the Swiss cantons, the New England town meetings, things like that. There you have real democracy. But in terms of a major country, or a minor country for that matter, no. When I was a teenager back in the 70s, there was a running joke, which was, in the United States and Western Europe, we have representative democracy. In the Soviet bloc, they had people's democracy. And Idi Amin of Uganda, the dictator there, defined cannibalism as nutritional democracy. And I think the latter is what the current leadership really hold. If you look at cannibalism as a metaphor,
Right.
and not, if you're not a literalist like Idi Amin was. But if you take it as a metaphor for modern governance, nutritional democracy is what it's about.
You mean sucking dry the resources of all the people to benefit themselves, the politicians?
Of course. Of course. I mean, stop and think about it. If democracy is the rule by the majority, do the majority of farmers in Great Britain and the Netherlands and Germany want to be thrown out of their property? Is that real? Is that what most people want? Is that a majority? I'm not entirely sure. Do most people want to be euthanized? I don't think so. I know that 50 years ago, the vast majority of people thought that abortion was murder. And that over the passage of 50 years, they had their views changed for them. Was that democracy? If what we were told democracy is, governments and their associated drones, hangers-on, and parasites ought not to be in the business of changing the people, but of delivering the people what they want. But no one can deny that over the past 50 years, the people have been changed and are continuing to be changed by their masters. I asked an old Central European once if he was living in the States, if he was a Republican or a Democrat. He said, well, I can't very well be a Republican because I'm a monarchist. And I can't be a Democrat because I do not believe in democracy. And I asked him, are you against democracy? He said, certainly not. But I'm not against the tooth fairy either. And I'm afraid that the false dichotomy of monarchy versus democracy is pitting something that is certainly real, whether you like it or not, versus the tooth fairy. That is a lesson that first and foremost has to be understood. There will always be the rulers, there will always be the ruled. The rulers will always be a minority. The ruled will always be a majority. That has been true in every human society that has ever existed from the beginning of mankind, and it will be until God closes the thing down. Now, that being the case, that being the reality of the situation, there's a second reality, and that is that every society has a sort of state church, an animating philosophy that decrees right and wrong, that gives legitimacy and authority to the rulership. It's always been that way and always will be. It doesn't have to be religious. Under the Soviets, communism was the state church. There is no God of Lenin as his prophet. With us, it's this sort of gooey, mealy-mouthed, weenie-ish liberalism that's, I don't know, it's just so awful. Everybody's got to be nice and I'll beat you to a pulp if you aren't. That, whatever that is, that's our state church today. There may be separation of my church and the state, but the state will always have some church of some kind. Because that, again, it's just the way human beings are. It's the way our civilizations are. It's the way our cultures are. So what makes one culture different from another is A, the nature of that animating principle, that state church, and B, as a result, the nature of the ruling class, of the rulership. Now, I'm actually, believe it or not, answering your question. What do I mean when I say that I'm a monarchist? Well, I'm obviously not a big fan of either the Ottoman sultans or the Qing emperors in China, although it hasn't escaped me that they were both better than what succeeded them. But my idea is Catholic Christian monarchy, which, if you boil it down to 5 points, looking at the different nations of Europe and elsewhere and what they and their proponents held in common, there were basically 5 points. in Catholic monarchy and Christian monarchy. The altar, which was the church as the animating spirit of society, the determining principle, the giver of legitimacy, and so on. The throne, which was a monarch with authority, but sufficient power to direct the state, as it were, foreign policy, the military, and all that. And internally, as Franz Josef put it very well, protect his people from their politicians. Because, of course, there's no one to do that in our current system. We're simply a buffet table for the political folk. But that is the nature of the throne, of course, hedged about by tradition and all that. The third point was local liberties, provincial rights, or what we today would call subsidiarity, which is just as important as the other two. The fourth, we would call today solidarity. And by that, we mean the notion of the different classes and elements of society as not as enemies, as contending against one another, but as distinct and different parts of a greater whole, working together as part of a family for the greater good. During the interwar period, they came up with all sorts of isms, names to try to describe that kind of a state. Solidarism, distributism, corporatism, on and on and on. But they were all describing different aspects of the same basic idea. And lastly, but not leastly, the notion of Christendom, of Abendland, the Reichsidee, the idea that all Christian nations are somehow united in a loose but real way. Those are the five elements of traditional monarchy, so far as I can discern them. And that is what I believe as a monarchist. Now, how you would apply that specifically to this or that country, that's a whole other issue. But before you can even think about applying anything to anything, you've got to have your basic ideas. You've got to have your first principles. Then you can get down to figuring out how you apply them. What we do today is that we ignore the whole idea of first principles and just try to apply things in a very pragmatic manner. And it has only one major problem with that. It doesn't work. Small problem, I grant you, tiny, little. But no, I have to admit, the nadir of my experience in my 62 years, now 64, with democracy was the COVID lockdown. I mean, this really ripped the face of the mask away from the real nature of power. Our masters run the show, and we'll do as they tell us, or we'll pay the price. One has to come to that understanding first. So when you understand that, and then you look at things like the stoplight coalition in Germany, you look at the president of Austria refusing to talk to the head of the FPÖ despite they're having the highest number of votes. You look at the cordon sanitaire that all the French parties put around Mademoiselle Le Pen. You see the same thing. We're all for the rules and we maintain them unless they're not in our favor, in which case we break them. Now, there's a real problem with that. And the problem with it is that it will radicalize the so-called far right. If you pretend that you believe in a certain set of rules and you consistently break them, God help you if your opponents ever come to power, because they won't forget what you did. And that's something that's a little too hard for our current political people to understand. Being most of them, my brother generation of 68 people, it's a combination of immaturity and senility, which you don't really see too often in other generations. But I like to say we're the only generation that grew old without ever growing up.
Interesting. Although you could maybe say the same about my generation of millennials. There's also the at least the notion that they don't want to grow up, or most of us don't want to really grow up. But I suppose our parents didn't, but I don't know.
Yeah. We didn't want to. See, you didn't have grandparents, really. Not the way we did.
Yeah.
I mean, my grandfather was in World War One. He lived through the Depression and the Second War and all that. They had real lives. My father was in the Second War, the Depression also as a boy. They had real lives. My generation had the 60s, the 70s, and that we gave to you. And I'm afraid it wasn't much of a gift. We couldn't, you can't expect more out of your children than you can expect out of yourself. Also, don't forget, you guys haven't gotten old yet. It'll be really, if you don't grow up, it'll really become grotesque then. Now it's not so bad. But you just wait. If you're 75 and you're still as ridiculous and selfish as you were at 16, it's going to be pretty grotesque, I promise.
Well, let's pray for the best.
All we can do.
Well, so I want to ask you, Charles, how and when did you become Catholic? Because you've been raised Catholic, I believe, but was there a sort of conversion experience or period of time where you really deepened your faith, and also when did you become a monarchist, and were those two things, were they connected or were they completely separate?
All good questions. Well, I was baptized at an early age. I don't remember it, but it was within a week of my birth, so I wasn't functioning on all cylinders just then. You see, I was raised in the period, I was born in 1960, the day that John F. Kennedy was elected. And I came of age and lived all my early Catholic life in the immediate aftermath of Vatican II. With all the changes going on in the church and so forth. And I went to a mixture of Catholic and government schools. My parents were not very happy with the changes, but they were also great intellectuals. And for my father in particular, both my brother and I had and have a huge admiration for him. So early on, I was in a position of, especially when going to Catholic schools, of having to defend the faith from my teachers. And so I never left it. I had to fight for it early. And that experience, my rebellion was not against the faith of my parents. My rebellion was against its denial by my teachers and by the priests. And my father used to tell my brother and me, if you lose the faith, you leave the church, then the priests and the nuns have won. Because that's the way it was then. Now I'm sure it's all much better.
Well, I think we've reached maybe a sort of low point already, but I'm not sure.
Well, there's always room for ruin, But no, actually, to be honest with you, bad as things are right now in the church, they were a lot worse when I was young. You're seeing these idiotic restrictions on the Tridentine Mass. There were no restrictions when I was a kid because it had been gotten rid of entirely. It was gone. Poof. So, but at any rate, to answer your question, so as far as monarchy went, my grandfather, my dad was French Canadian, very patriotic American, third generation. First language is French, Canadian French, the best kind. Anyway, we tell ourselves that over and over, so I'm hoping it'll become true. Anyway, but no, he was very, very fond of the Bourbon who sent our ancestors to Quebec and very fond of the House of Stuart. It was a real Jacobite because we had an ancestor who fought at Culloden and then came to Canada, and whose daughter married a French Canadian. So you see, there was that going on. And my dad was something of an amateur historian as well, and he loved the whole colonial era of American history. So this was very much on my mind from his side. My mother, she was very much a lover of both the Habsburgs and the Romanovs because of her family. And these two together didn't make me a monarchist, but what they did was they dispelled the anti-monarchical prejudice that most Americans have. As time went on, I began to see not just the similarities between the American Revolution, which incidentally in the Declaration of Independence denounced the Quebec Act that gave my ancestors freedom, religion, and laws, and that wasn't lost on me. But it denounces the Quebec Act. Anyway, I saw that not just the influence on the French Revolution, but the realization that without the American Revolution, there wouldn't have been a French Revolution. And that got me thinking, if the Jacobins were wrong in France, maybe the Loyalists in America were right. None of this was really crystallized, although as I studied the overthrow of one monarchy after another, I came to the realization that, for all their faults, they were almost always better than what replaced them. See, and that's something that people never really talk about. Oh, the people overthrew the monarchy. Okay, that's nice. And what replaced the monarchy? Was that a decent bunch you'd want to live under? And time and again, gee, not really. So maybe there was a problem there. The thing that really led me to calling myself a monarchist, to be honest with you, was the events in Greece in 1974-5, when King Constantine, who had risked his life against the junta, King Constantine was overthrown by the junta, obviously. And then when they were out, his former prime minister called a plebiscite on the monarchy. Oh, I get it. Now that he's gone, you were hiding. That was Constantine Caramandes. You were hiding in exile all this time. You come back, and you're going to keep your king out. That's great. The king was not allowed to campaign. He was allowed a single television appearance. I mean, the whole thing stank. And this was the man, the king, who had risked not only his life, but his family's life for his people. And they get replaced by this conniving nitwit. I thought, and of course, nobody's outraged by this. Nobody's upset. Oh, well, it's just business as usual. Yeah, okay, great. Great. That is when I first started thinking of myself as a monarchist. Because, look at the alternative. Slime. I mean, take a man, not to get too Austrian, too Austro-centric here, but look at the infamous Karl Renner, upon whom the whole legitimacy of your political system rests today. This is a man who sold his country out 3 times. I mean, if you don't have an axe in the fight, you look at your man Renner betraying Emperor Karl in 1918. You look at him basically sabotaging Parliament in 1932. Oh, yes, I know. Dollfuss refused to call for new elections, so he was the murderer of democracy. Well, Dollfuss was afraid that if he did call for new elections, the Social Democrats and the Nazis would gang up together and sell the country to Germany. Oh, which is what happened in 1938. The second time Renner betrayed his country. And then, fast forward, 1945, he gives himself over to Stalin and dies as president of the country in 1950. This is a hero? I do not understand how any Austrian who really knows his history could stand that kind of being associated with that kind of stench. It's ridiculous. But fortunately, it's not just Austria. It's almost every republic you want to point at. The French, Robespierre. The Italians, Mussolini, really. And on it goes. So I think of Winston Churchill, who was only what you would call either pro-German or pro-Austrian. But he said if it weren't for Woodrow Wilson insisting on getting rid of the Habsburgs and the Hohenzollerns and the Wittelsbachs and the rest, Hitler would never have climbed out of the sewer, and the Soviet Union would never have owned half of Europe after. And we did that, the greatest republic in the world. That's called reality. And we don't like to think about it. We don't like to deal with it. We just forget it, you know. We don't want anything to do with it. We want to hide it in the corner. Well, yes, I am a monarchist. I'm willing to look that history right in the face. And I guess that's the easiest way to put it. The two things that made me a monarchist were firstly my faith, Christ the King and all that, and the nature of Catholic monarchy. I could go on and on about coronations and the rest of it, but you get the idea. And the second is the willingness to look Republican history right in the face and accept it for what it is, which is usually despicable. The only way you could avoid that is by not doing it, by not looking it in the face, and by pretending. And that, of course, is what one does, pretends. Over and over and over again. That's why in country after country, no matter how long ago the monarchy was overthrown, officialdom has to constantly attack it over and over and over again. If I had a dime in this country for every time I read yet another official scholarly attack on the House of Habsburg, I'd be a rich man. They never stop. And yet at the same time, they milk the legacy of the Habsburgs for money, of course.
For tourism.
So, yes. So what would you think of such people? I remember back in 2009, I was over here, and there was a big sign on the Hofburg, sorry, we have no emperors, only their jewels. I mean, that's basically, it's like saying, oh, well, we're a band of thieves. But again, they didn't get it. I mean, you can ask, well, gee, does this mean anything in the immediate? Well, as I say, it does if you're a farmer or a member of some other group that have been targeted for displacement. It means a lot. It means a lot if you've ever been the victim of cancel culture. It means a lot if you've ever expressed an idea that's unpopular and gotten smacked around for it. You know, one of the little experiments I like to play with Europeans is this. Every now and then, someone will bring up to me the Inquisition and say, wasn't it terrible that people were punished for their beliefs? My response is always, well, every society punishes those who hold beliefs it doesn't agree with. We don't. Oh, no. What would happen if someone denied the historicity of the Holocaust? Now, I believe in the historicity of the Holocaust. I had enough relations that died in it. My grandmother's favorite cousin, for instance. So, you don't have to convince me about how horrible the Nazis were. Not only that, they were very much in their first principles a lot like the ruling classes today. So you know they're bad. Pro-abortion, pro-contraception. When it suited them, pro-gay. So, the Nazis were very modern people. Nevertheless, if you deny the historicity of the Holocaust, it's a crime. Now, if you think that an egregious historical error should be made a crime, that's fine, but don't pretend you believe in freedom of speech and thought. You don't. But that brings us back in turn to the state church, to the defining dogma of the society, which is something we will never admit we have. But we will punish you if you deviate. Well, you can't really have it both ways, can you? Except they do.
Right. Yeah, it's typical. It's the myth of the neutral state that doesn't exist. The state is never neutral. It will always have. And if it pretends to be a secular state, it is not neutral in itself because it's actually against religion. It says that religion should be kept out of or at least, the Christian religion should be kept out of public square in that sense, or of public office.
Precisely, which is also why you'll notice increasingly over the years, thinking of the Nazis again, most of the countries in Europe are very uncomfortable with the memory of the resistance. I mean, whenever you read about somebody like Sylvester Spitzenberg or Herbert Meyer here in Austria, or Stauffenberg in Germany, Delaroque in France, and so on and so on, the current governments are uncomfortable with these people because they oppose the Nazis for precisely the reasons they would oppose the governments today. And the governments today would try to cancel them if they were still alive, the way they do now. I mean, nothing strikes me as sadder than that. You have a situation where, I just mentioned Father Heinrich Meyer, who was I think it was the last major resistance figure to be executed by the Nazis in Austria. Have you heard of him?
I'm not sure. I don't know. Maybe you can expand on it a little bit.
My point precisely. Of course you haven't. Because he's exactly the kind of person that the current regime loathe. So just so you know, I'm going to go to Wikipedia, a source of all truth and knowledge. If it's in Wikipedia, it has to be true. Well, okay, maybe not. Anyway, Heinrich Meyer. Let's see, 16 February 1908 to 22 March 1945, was an Austrian Roman Catholic priest, pedagogue, philosopher, and a member of the Austrian resistance, who was executed as the last victim of Hitler's regime in Vienna. The resistance group he led is considered one of the most important for the Allies during World War II. Well, I do recommend that you read the article in its entirety. I could spend hours going over it, but it's quite astonishing. Suffice to say, though, that the group that he was with, Meyer was very involved in the resistance against the Nazi Party. He had been actively involved in the idea of resistance since 1940 and saw himself as a priest committed to it. His Christian faith and his humanistic worldview forced him to take action against the advice of his superiors against Nazism. As early as May and June 1940, he contacted resistance groups around Jakob Kaiser, Felix Hodes, Louis Weinberger, Adolf Scheff, and Karl Zeitz. Out of his conviction, the Catholic faith, and Austrian patriotism, he was a resistance fighter who ultimately did not rule out militant means to suppress the Nazi regime. He founded the resistance group Meyer Mester Kaldonazzi, together with the Tyrolean Catholic monarchist fighter Walter Kaldonazzi from Aus and South Tyrol, and the policeman Andreas Hofer, a direct descendant of the Andreas Hofer of the Napoleonic era. Anyway, it goes on and on. The point I'm making is that he really epitomized in his loyalty to the House of Habsburg, in his desire for a Catholic and united Central Europe. He was everything the current government don't want. It's just not.
They'd probably frame him.
Not
They'd probably frame him as a Nazi today.
Well, that's what they would do. They would attack him as a Nazi because he was everything they weren't. And it's the same in Germany. It's the same in the Netherlands, Denmark, and on and on and on and on. The bulk of the resistance in Europe between the wars against the Nazis were Catholic conservatives or Christian conservatives, and monarchists very often, who would have seen the current regimes to be quite as evil as the ones they fought against during the war. And again, that too is one of the reasons I'm monarchist.
Yeah.
I would rather stand with those men than with these. Does that make sense? I mean, right now they're debating euthanasia in Great Britain with the new government of Sir Keir Starmer. Sorry, I slipped. They're yapping about safeguards to euthanasia. Safeguards. Well, what about safeguards to genocide? I believe genocide should be kept within particular proper bounds and should be safe, legal, and rare. Really? Okay, great. What kind of a man does that make me? What kind of a man would those heroes of the resistance have thought I was if I espoused such principles? They would think they had fought in vain and that the Nazis had won. That's what they would think. And in a certain sense, they're right. There was a Hungarian philosopher and historian by the name of John Lukács who wrote a very interesting book I recommend highly called The Hitler of History. And he makes an important point in that book. In 1815, the Allies thought that they had put the genie of Napoleon, of Bonapartism, back into the bottle. But by 1914, almost every country in Europe was run on Bonapartist lines. Well, in 1945, the Allies thought they'd put the genie of Nazism back into the bottle. But now almost every country in the West, and I'll say Russia and China to boot, are run along similar lines to those of the Nazis. And that's not because the Nazis won in the sense that Germany triumphed. It's because they, like the communists, like the fascists, like a lot of movements today, general liberalism, they were all symptoms of the same sort of modernity, which deposed God, put man in his place, and since all men can't rule, ended up elevating a particular man, an Ubermensch, if you will. Our modern Ubermensch, of course, and people like, I can't think of his name. The computer man, wealthiest man in the
Gates,
world. That's the one, Bill Gates, couldn't think of his name. That's our kind of Ubermensch today, or George Soros. There's another Ubermensch for you. Everyone else, an Untermensch, to be played with as our masters enjoy playing with them. And again, nobody asks the question why, who gives them this right, et cetera, ad nauseam.
Well, thank you, Charles. Very interesting points that you made. Since we were on the topic of Austrian history already, as I've already mentioned, you have written a book about Blessed Karl of Austria, the last emperor. Why did you choose to write a book about him? Why do you think he is so significant as a person, given that he only ruled for 2 years, from 1916 to 1918? And what do you think we can learn from him today?
Again, all good questions. Well, first, I have to say I didn't actually choose to write about him. What happened was I had decided I would attend the ITI in Austria. I'd been accepted. I was getting ready to move. I had not mentioned this to my editor, the late and much lamented John Morehouse at Tab Bourse, and he called me, not knowing that I was moving to Austria. And he asked me, "Do you think you could write a book about Blessed Karl?" And I said, "Well, John, as it happens, I'm moving to Austria. So I think I might be able to do just that." And I did. But of course, his is a story I've followed very carefully for a long time. I was at his beatification in 2004, and I had known his son, the Archduke Otto, in a certain way since I was in high school. I neglected to mention this, but the Archduke and I corresponded from the time that I was in high school until he died.
Archduke Otto, that is, right?
He was
No. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and he was a very big influence on me, on my thought and development and so on. He was so that that was definitely Karl was someone I certainly know about and whose cause I believed in terms of his beatification and all the rest of it. But after he was beatified, I was amazed at the growth of interest in him in the United States. They just dedicated the 31st shrine in the United States to him in Cincinnati, Ohio. So one of the questions I had to deal with in my book was why his popularity amongst Americans, which is sort of counterintuitive when you consider how we generally feel about people in countries we fought wars with. Well, there are several things to answer your questions about him. Firstly, he epitomizes the kind of leadership that we are not familiar with today, and that is a sacrificial sort of leadership that would put itself on the line for its subjects, rather than simply, having it slaughtered or taxed or both for its own benefit, which is what we're used to in modern governance. So he runs counter to everything we know in our experience of public life, and that's very refreshing. That's one thing. Two, everything you learn about him, his relationship with his wife and his children, his parents, everything is ideal. He really is like a character of Arthurian legend come to life, like some medieval paladin who rides across the stage, draws the sword, and then whether he wins or loses, vanishes again, and the night closes in. Like Arthur or Charlemagne or Godefroy de Bouillon or El Cid, except he lived in our time. He's not a character of folklore. He's not a character of romance. He is an historical, verifiable figure in whose lifetime there's still a few people left who lived there. A handful, but, And of course, when I was young, there were tons of people who had either known him or seen him or whatever. So it was very much a real character in a way. I mean, he gives us hope that we can have men like that at the helm. It doesn't have to be the kind of riffraff that we're familiar with. Leadership do not have to be scum. They can be really grand. And that is a message which we all need to hear. And the other thing, as I mentioned, following that train, if every father tried to be Karl, if every husband tried to be Karl, if every son tried to be Karl, well, there'd be a lot happier wives, children, and parents running around. One of the things that struck me about him literally at the very end of my book, as I was finishing the last page, he's a great patron for soldiers, for rulers, for fathers, for husbands, and so on. All true. But there was something else that nobody had written about, and that was he's a great patron for people from broken homes or disturbed homes, because his parents did not get on well. They were badly suited for each other, to say the least. And yet, not only did he get on well with both of them and love them equally, but he got the best out of both of them. He got his father's devil-may-care, charming manner without the promiscuity. And he got his mother's deep devotion and piety and loyalty without the dourness. And he put all of that together. And again, no kid does this consciously. You get what you get from your parents. You don't sit down and measure out. He certainly didn't. But he managed to get the best from both and to stay on good terms with both of them, which was also no small feat. And I believe that later on he would use this when he had to deal with his uncle, Franz Ferdinand, who was like a second father to him, and his great uncle, the Emperor Franz Joseph. Now, he and his wife could easily have become the focus of a third sort of center of intrigue. No. Instead, he stayed loyal to and loving to and faithful to both his uncle and his great uncle. And I got to tell you, too, one of the things that emerged from writing the book was the greatness of Franz Ferdinand. He really, I was really impressed by him, because this is a man who was married morganically. His children can't inherit the throne. And now he has to play guardian to his ne'er-do-well brother's son. A lesser man would have hated him. No. He loved Karl. He guided him. He mentored him. He showed him, and really he was the only one in the immediate Habsburg family who could do this. He showed him the model of a happy family. People look at Karl and Zita and they say, wow, they were very close, they were a happy couple. All true. But the prototype for them was Franz Ferdinand and Sophie. And that's something that really jumped out at me in writing the book. As, of course, the very tragic nature of Franz Joseph, whose life was just one long series of pain and disappointment, with him always trying to do his best. And sometimes, usually, he managed pretty well. When he failed spectacularly. But it didn't happen often. Of course, on the other hand, you only needed it a couple of times to really mess things up. But at any rate, so that's the thing about Karl. And I remember, he died, of course, because the Allies cut off any funding to him. So he had no money for decent lodging or food or medicine. And that is really what killed him, ultimately. But I remember he always said to his wife on the day he died, I am suffering that my peoples might come back together. And in the years that I've lived here in Central Europe, in Austria, and I look at here, and Czechia, and Hungary, Slovakia, Slovenia, Croatia, it's impossible for me to believe that prayer and that suffering will go unheeded forever. When you look at what's pressuring both sides, from Russia on the one side and the West on the other, well, the sooner the better, says I.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Charles, you've lived in Austria for quite some time now, a couple of years, and you seem
seven, but who's counting?
Yeah. Okay, very good. And you seem like you've showed already when you talk about Austrian history, but you seem to have a special appreciation for the country even today, even though things are not maybe going smoothly, or maybe not as you would like politically. But as an American who studied Austrian history and culture and who has also lived here, what would you like Austrians to rediscover about the heritage specifically?
Three things: the Habsburgs, and not in the twisted, screwy way they've been presented, but as they were. Dollfuss, again, not in the twisted, screwy way, but as he was. And the third was part of being is being part of the larger whole. Central Europe, in particular, Europe in general, because I believe that Austria, and put the EU out of your mind. Forget the EU. Forget the Brussels superstate. I believe that Austria has a very specific Catholic and European, dare I say, abendländische vocation. And if she's to be truly happy, if her people to be truly happy, they need to embrace that. They need to be proud of it. They need to accept it. You know, I remember when I was here just a year or two, and there was a big to-do about events on the Kallenberg. 3 Vienna papers had the same stupid paragraph in them, I should say, plural, about how the siege of Vienna's breaking, the defeat of the Turks, was only celebrated by far right-wingers, like the Christchurch assassin and the murderer in Sweden, or Norway, or wherever it was. It was precisely the same stupid paragraph in 3 different articles by 3 different authors in 3 different Vienna newspapers. That can't be tolerated. Stupidity on that level is simply criminal. No one has a right to be that stupid. They just don't. It can't be tolerated. So I think Austrians have to rediscover, in mentioning all of these I mentioned, they really have to discover their sense of self. You know, they were the bulwark of Christianity against the Turks. They were the bulwark of Catholicism against the Prussians. In the 19th century, from 1826 to 1914, when something happened or other, through the Leopoldine Stiftung, headed by the Austrian Emperor, the Habsburgs in particular, Austrians in general, funneled millions of dollars into the Catholic Church in America. They founded 400 parishes. They funded 300 missionaries, including great saints like St. John Neumann and Venerable Bishop Baraga. Austria did that. Now, you have this thing about how during the war all Austrians were collaborators. No, they weren't. They were not. The socialists were. Oh, yes. A few of the communists who were not. A few of the socialists were not collaborators. The bulk of the socialists were. The pan-German/Nazis were. The Catholics and the monarchists were not. That is to say, the people who were truest to the Austrian identity stood up for Austria. That's something to be proud of. Every Austrian kid should know the name of Father Heinrich Meyer and his associates. No, but they were monarchists. They wanted to bring the Habsburgs back, and most of them were like Dollfuss. Yeah, well, they weren't Nazis. That's what you just said. You could say, of course, the opposite. Hating Habsburg and Dollfuss, etc., was the hallmark of the Nazi. You could say that. And that, too, you have to accept, because it's simply reality. But I assure you, if the bulk of Austrians ever find their way to accepting the truth about their country and themselves, they'll be proud of both, and they'll be able to resume the work that God has in mind for them. I do believe, that God has a vocation for every country. a particular one. And it varies from time to time, place to place, just as he does for every individual. And real happiness for the individual and for the aggregate, for the country, comes from trying to discern the will of God and fulfill it. Nothing else brings happiness. If you have a leadership that set themselves up in opposition to that will, then nothing can follow from it but disaster and horror. And that's a lesson that you would think Central Europe had learned since 1918. Apparently not.
Well, thank you for your answer, Charles. Certainly very thought-provoking, and what you've said, and it's a very interesting perspective that you bring as a historian who's not Austrian but who's lived in Austria. You bring a kind of perspective that maybe others wouldn't have. So I think that's very, very insightful to hear.
Well, thank you. I mean, what can I tell you? I love Austria, and it's a funny thing. I joined because I was a full-time student. I joined an Austrian student fraternity of the Catholic variety, and during the board you have to face going through it. One of them asked me, one of the by now Bundeswirten asked a very good question. He said, "You're an American from Austria. In this particular fraternity, patria, homeland, is one of the foundations of what we do. What would you do if there was ever a dispute between Austria and the United States? On which side would your loyalties lie?" Fair question. I looked at him and I smiled and I said, the only way that could ever happen is if Austria became a Catholic monarchy again. And if that ever happened, I know exactly where my loyalties would lie. And I think it's fair to say. Of course, then again, if you present me with the problem, what if that happened to America too, and you had two of them? Well, then I'd have problems. But I highly doubt the issue is going to come up when I'm alive. So I was able, I think, to dodge the question well. But they're really, the thing you've got to bear in mind is that the current order in Austria and Central Europe was imposed from outside. Really, much as one might dislike Karl or Admiral Horthy or any of the other villains in Kaiser Karl's story, none of them would have had the power they had to do to him what they did without our own President Woodrow Wilson. And that, you've got to set up, let me see if I can reduce this to a couple of words. You've got to set up where the establishment of the country was imposed from outside upon the country. But to doubt that would immediately imperil the legitimacy of that establishment. And that's why it can't really be looked at. Karl passed two laws in 1919 that are worth touching on before we rush off. One was the Habsburg Law, most of which has been undone since. But Habsburg, who didn't renounce the throne, couldn't be in Austria. No Habsburg could be president. And lastly, but definitely not leastly, a ton of property was stolen from the direct members of the family. In 1935, this property was returned. In 1938, it was taken again by the Nazis, and the Austrian government have held on to it ever since. So I describe it in my book as Nazi loot. Now, you have to understand, I've lived most of my life in Los Angeles, and where I lived, Nazi loot has a very specific meaning. That is to say, property nicked by the Nazis from its owners and held on to by current governments. So when I mentioned this to an Austrian heritage of a more socialist persuasion, he said, "Oh, you mustn't call it Nazi loot." I said, "Well, that's what it is." No, you don't understand. To return the family's property would be to imperil the very legitimacy of our Constitution. And I looked at him and I said, if returning Nazi loot would somehow imperil that legitimacy, meaning that legitimacy needs to be imperiled, what kind of a constitution requires Nazi approbation to be legitimate? He didn't want to discuss it further. But the second law he did was the anti-nobility law. It forbade anyone to use titles or fun, and under it, the Archduke Karl von Habsburg was prosecuted a couple of years ago. All I can tell you is, stupid as the Habsburg law is, the nobility law is stupider. I mean, you talk about theft of people's property. I think Austria, as it is, will have reached maturity when the Renner laws are knocked down.
Yeah.
I don't know what that'll take. That's your doing, not mine.
Interesting. Yeah, we'll see. We'll see. I think there may be other fronts to fight on in the meantime. But, who knows? Who knows? Everything's possible. I think things are going so badly that hopefully God will intervene at some point and people will return to Christ. That would of course be the best.
If they don't, I promise things will get worse. Again, we're like the children of Israel in the Old Testament. Didn't quite get it. Bam. Didn't quite get it. Bam. Didn't quite get it. Bam. Until eventually, Lord, I think something's a little wrong here. It may take us a while to wake up, but don't worry, it's as bad in America.
Right. Well, yeah, that would be a question for another interview. That and Woodrow Wilson, that would be its own interview at some point. But yeah, well, thank you very much, Charles. Last quick question: where can people buy your books and read your articles? And what are you working on right now?
Boy. Okay. Well, you can get all my books via Amazon, of course. The distributor in Europe is Gracewing. Tumblr House is my publisher in the United States, alongside Tan Books. You can see my weekly podcast at the Tumblr House YouTube channel. Tumblr is spelled Tumblar, Tumblr House. The weekly podcast is called Off the Menu. And then as far as reading my stuff, the European Conservative, Crisis Magazine, Peter
5.
Peter 1.5. Boy, I'm getting
1
tired.
Peter 5,
1.5
right?
and Catholic. That's it. Peter 1.35 and Catholicism.org are my major outlets, so I occasionally appear elsewhere. That's you can find us. What I'm working on now, I've completed A Life of Zita, which will be coming out around May 30th.
Yeah,
from
the
Cannes.
wife of Blessed Emperor Charles.
That's right. So servant of God Zita, she's up for beatification. And then I am working now on a book on Otto von Habsburg. I'm actually trying to collect his writings about America, because he certainly had points of view, and he spent the war years in America. Interestingly enough, his two brothers, his younger brothers, he sent to Tyrol to fight with the resistance. And then when the war was ended, he came to Innsbruck, which was occupied by the French, and set up a headquarters. So Karl Renner, by then having been made chancellor by Stalin, ordered them thrown out of the country under the Habsburg law. Two resistance fighters and the man who had been advising Roosevelt for Austria's benefit get thrown out by a collaborator. Who says virtue is in its own reward?
Well, yeah. Well, thank you so much. So people can go there and read your books, and we'll definitely link to your podcast and so on, and your books as well. Thank you, Charles. It was really a blast and a blessing to listen to you. And yeah, hopefully we'll see each other soon.